Welcome to Twilight Fables, where familiar tales grow dark and shadows whisper truths too dreadful for the daylight. Tonight, we begin the story of two sisters, bound by love and undone by the secret they chose to shelter. This is Snow White and Rose Red, the bear's secret. The winter was a cruel one. Snow fell early and heavy, smothering the ground in drifts so deep the deer disappeared and the streams froze over solid. The forest had grown strangely silent, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath beneath the weight of the sky. In that silence, every sound carried too far. An owl's cry, the snap of a branch, the creak of ice shifting in the riverbeds. The only sign of life came from a small cottage pressed against the edge of the woods. Thin smoke curled from its crooked chimney, blurring into the white sky. Inside, the hearth burned as brightly as the family could manage, though the woodpile had shrunk alarmingly fast that winter. A woman stirred broth over the fire, her face lined with the map of too many hard years. Beside her sat her daughters, Snow White and Rose Red. The sisters were as different as frost and flame. Snow White, the elder by a single year, was pale and quiet. Her hair gleamed like pale wheat, braided simply across her crown. She had the sort of stillness that made people lower their voices in her presence, as though afraid to disturb something delicate. She worked with a needle now, mending an old apron with careful, patient stitches. Even her hands seemed gentle, the bones narrow, the movements deliberate. Rose Red was her opposite. Her hair was thick and dark, her skin flushed with health, her eyes restless and quick. She sat by the window, tapping her fingers against the sill in some imagined rhythm. She hated the silence of snow. It pressed too heavily on her chest, like a smothering blanket. Whenever the wind shrieked, she longed to shriek back, just to remind the forest there was still fire in the world. Their mother glanced between them as she worked the ladle, her lips pursed tight. She had seen enough winters to know that silence was never just silence. It was a warning. "It will be a lean season," she said softly, as though speaking too loudly might draw attention. "The forest has turned against us. The traps are bare. Even the rabbits stay underground. I fear the hunger this year." Snow White looked up from her sewing. "The forest gives what it can, Mother. It has always cared for us." Rose Red snorted. "The forest gives what it wants, and it takes more than it gives." Her mother turned sharply, eyes flashing. "Do not speak so. These woods have ears, and they remember insult." Snow White bowed her head respectfully, but Rose Red turned back to the window without apology. The truth was that the forest had been changing. Even she could admit it. The girls had grown up playing among the trees, collecting herbs and berries, leaving offerings for the spirits when their mother insisted. But this winter, something had soured. Sometimes they found bones scattered outside their cottage door. Hare bones, deer bones, once even the skull of a fox, arranged deliberately in circles. Once, in the middle of January, Rose Red had woken to find roses blooming in the snowdrifts. Not their own roses, not any she recognised. These had grown overnight, petals heavy as blood, each thorn wickedly long. She had crushed one under her boot. Defiant, Snow White had gathered another carefully and set it in water, whispering that beauty, wherever it appeared, should not be wasted. And always, when the night was deepest, there came the sound of something breathing in the trees. Not quite a howl, not quite a growl, more like a sigh too vast for human lungs. Now, in the cottage, the broth simmered and cracked softly as the fire popped. The sisters tried to lose themselves in small tasks, mending, stirring, sharpening, but that silence outside pressed ever closer, as though waiting. The first knock nearly tore the door from its hinges. Snow White dropped her needle. Rose Red leapt from the bench, already reaching for the iron poker. Their mother froze, ladle raised, broth dripping back into the pot. The second knock rattled the whole cottage. No one came so deep into the woods, not in weather like this. Travellers avoided their path entirely, and the neighbours from the village dared only in summer to visit. The third knock came with a groan of wood, and a low sound followed, like stone grinding against stone. Their mother drew a sharp breath, then steeled herself. She set the ladle down, wiped her hands on her skirt, and moved toward the door. "Stay by the fire," she ordered. Rose Red gripped the poker in both hands. Snow White rose to her feet, her heart beating high in her throat. The latch lifted with a creak. The door swung inward. Snow blasted into the room, a spray of cold crystals, and in the doorway loomed a shadow so vast it seemed the cottage shrank around it. A bear stood there. He was huge, his head nearly brushing the top of the frame, his body thick with fur, as black as midnight. Snow clung to his coat in glittering patches. His breath steamed in the air, each exhale rumbling. His eyes, gold and unnatural, burned like coals in the firelight. Rose Red raised the poker. "Mother!" But before she could strike, the bear spoke. "Let me in," he said. The words were slow, guttural, like stones tumbling down a well, but they were words nonetheless. The sisters froze. Even their mother's face blanched. For a beast to speak was no ordinary thing. It meant curse, or blessing, or worse. The bear lowered his head, the snow sliding from his back. "The cold drives me from the forest. I seek only warmth." Their mother's hand trembled on the doorframe. She had heard tales of such things, tales of beasts that beg shelter only to devour their hosts once inside. And yet, the old laws weighed heavier. No soul, man or beast, might be turned away on a night such as this. She stepped aside. "Come in then." The bear ducked beneath the frame, squeezing his massive form inside. The firelight wavered over his fur, glinting red in the sheen of his pelt. The cottage seemed suddenly smaller, the shadows deeper. He lowered himself to the hearth without being asked, settling with a thud that shook the floorboards. He exhaled, and the smell of wild earth filled the room. Rose Red did not lower the poker. "Why are you here? What are you?" The bear turned his golden eyes on her. They reflected the flames like metal mirrors. "I told you, the cold drives me from the woods." Snow White stepped closer. The bear's bulk should have frightened her, but there was something else in those eyes, something she could not name. A sorrow, a warning, a plea. "Rest then," she whispered. Her sister hissed in her ear. "Are you mad? We don't know what it is." Snow White's lips curved faintly, and yet it knocked before entering. Their mother stirred the broth again, though her hand shook. "Some beasts only wear fur to hide their hunger," she muttered. The bear did not answer. His head lowered, his eyes half-lidded, but in the stillness of the cottage, a low vibration thrummed from his chest. Not quite a growl, not quite a purr, a sound that set the fire popping louder, that made the broth ripple in its pot. That night, the sisters lay side by side in their bed, staring at the ceiling beams. Sleep came slowly, if at all. Snow White dreamed first. She wandered barefoot through snow, but the cold did not bite her skin. Each step left roses blooming in her wake, crimson petals falling against the white. A shadow walked beside her, vast, heavy, breathing hot against her cheek. She did not turn to see it, but she knew it watched her with golden eyes. Rose Red dreamed differently. She ran through the forest, the snow breaking under her boots. Behind her came the sound of pursuit, teeth snapping, claws tearing the earth, a growl swelling larger and larger. She ran until her throat burned, but the sound was always just a breath behind. They woke before dawn, gasping. The fire had burned low, the coals still smouldering. The bear lay in front of it, eyes wide open, unblinking. He had not moved all night, and he was watching them. The days after the bear entered their cottage blurred strangely, as though winter itself shifted to make room for him. At first, he did not move much. He lay on the rug by the hearth, close enough to the fire that his fur steamed where snow had melted into it. His body was so vast that the sisters had to step carefully around him, lest they brush against his coarse coat. He did not seem to eat. Their mother, perhaps out of duty or fear, left scraps of broth and bread at the edge of the rug, but he ignored them. Sometimes, in the night, the bowl would be empty, but none of them ever saw him eat. Rose Red found it unbearable. Each morning she woke with her hands clenched tight, as though she had been gripping the poker in her sleep. Each day she found new reasons to clatter pans or slam shutters, hoping to startle him, to make him react. But the bear only lifted his head to watch her, those gold eyes unreadable. Snow White, by contrast, found herself softening toward him. She spoke little, but often she sat near the fire, sewing or mending in silence. She would glance at the bear occasionally, and if his eyes met hers, she did not look away. Their mother hovered uneasily between the two daughters' approaches. She warned them not to touch him, not to stray too close, not to trust too easily, but her voice held less certainty each passing day, as though she too felt the pull of something larger than her warnings. It was not only the bear's presence that unsettled them. The cottage itself seemed changed. The fire burned longer, needing less wood. The broth stretched further than it should have, as if the pot refilled itself each night. But the shadows on the walls grew darker. The corners of the house seemed to shift when no one looked directly at them. And sometimes, late at night, the girls woke to the sound of pacing, slow, heavy steps across the wooden floor. When Rose Red rushed to peer out of the bedroom, the bear lay exactly where he had been, eyes half-lidded as if he had never moved. Snow White, though, admitted once in a whisper, "I hear him speaking." "To who?" Rose Red demanded. "To the dark," Snow White said simply. One evening, while the bear dozed by the fire, the sisters took their tasks outside to the shed. The snow was high against the walls, but the sky had cleared for once, stars glittering above like chips of ice. Rose Red split kindling furiously, her axe biting into the wood with sharp cracks. "We should drive it out," she muttered. "He doesn't belong here." Snow White stacked the pieces neatly, her breath misting in the air. "Would you drive out a man who knocked in the snow?" "It's not a man," Rose Red hissed. "It's not even a beast. It talks. It watches. He hasn't blinked in 2 days, Snow." Snow White hesitated, but her gaze softened. "He hasn't harmed us." "That's not the same as being safe." Before Snow White could answer, a sound carried through the woods, a sharp, grating cry, like a rusty hinge forced open. Both sisters froze, listening. From the trees emerged a figure. At first, Rose Red thought it was a child, but as it drew closer, she saw it was a man, no taller than her waist. His beard dragged the ground, tangled and filthy. His face was twisted into a permanent sneer, his eyes too sharp for his size. His clothes were gaudy and torn, as though once fine but long neglected. The dwarf shuffled forward, glaring at them. "Fools!" he spat. His voice was high-pitched, grating. "Sheltering a thief in your home. Do you know what you've done?" The sisters exchanged glances. Rose Red tightened her grip on the axe. "And what business is it of yours?" The dwarf pointed a crooked finger at the cottage. "That bear, he is cursed. He is bound to hunger, and every day you keep him by your hearth. You feed it." Snow White's breath caught. "What do you mean, cursed?" The dwarf's mouth twisted further. "Once he was something else. Something bound to me, but he broke his chains. Now he walks in borrowed fur, and every kindness you show him becomes meat in his belly. Rose Red narrowed her eyes. You're lying. You just want us to drive him out, so you can take whatever he's guarding. The dwarf hissed between his teeth. You stupid girl. Do you think a beast asks for shelter because it is polite? Do you think it knocks because it remembers manners? No, it knocks because once you invite it in, it never leaves. Before Rose Red could swing the axe at him, he vanished into the trees with surprising speed, his beard whipping behind him like a trailing rope. They returned inside to find the bear awake, his eyes fixed on the door. Who was outside? His voice was deep but quiet. Snow White hesitated. Rose Red stepped forward, defiant. A dwarf. He said you're cursed, that you're only here to feed. The bear's gaze lingered on her. Slowly, he shook his head. Do not listen to that one. His words are poison. He would see you turn against me. Snow White swallowed. Why? The bear's voice dropped lower, almost a growl. Because he is the one who bound me. From that night, the sisters could not agree. Rose Red grew harsher, convinced the dwarf's warnings were truth. She watched the bear constantly, waiting for proof of malice. She whispered to their mother, urging her to help drive it away. But their mother only wrung her hands and muttered of old laws, of dangers in breaking them. Snow White grew gentler. She defended the bear, argued that if he were dangerous, he would have harmed them already. She sat by him in the evenings, sometimes daring to touch his fur. His coat was coarse, heavy, but warm. She said she felt calm in his presence, as though his breath matched her own. The bear said little, but sometimes, when the fire burned low, Snow White swore she heard him speak, not to her, not to the others, but to something unseen. His words rumbled deep and low, like prayers in a tongue she could not understand. And though the broth stretched longer, though the fire seemed to burn brighter, the shadows in the corners of the cottage grew darker still. One morning, Snow White woke to find her sewing undone, every stitch pulled out neatly, the thread coiled beside her bed. Rose Red swore she had not touched it. Their mother did not even look surprised. The forest remembers, she murmured. The dwarf came again, days later. This time, he had his beard caught in the fork of a tree. He shouted and cursed as the sisters passed by, demanding they cut him free. Rose Red laughed at first, but Snow White could not stand his struggling, and used her knife to slice the hairs. The moment he was free, the dwarf spat at her. Every kindness you give, girl, binds you closer to him. You'll learn too late. Then he disappeared again, scuttling into the snow. When they told the bear, he only growled low, pressing closer to the fire. Keep away from him, he warned. His lies are traps. But Rose Red could not help noticing that when the bear shifted, the rug beneath him bore claw marks, marks that bled faintly, as though from wounds long healed. and never closing. That night, both sisters dreamed again. Snow White dreamed of lying beside the hearth, her head resting against the bear's chest. His heartbeat was slow, steady, and her own matched it perfectly, as though she were no longer her own body. When she looked up, she saw not fur but skin, pale, stretched too thin over bone, the eyes still golden and gleaming. Rose Red dreamed of roses blooming in her hands, but when she tried to smell them, the petals turned to lips that whispered her name. Behind her, the dwarf laughed. They woke at the same moment. The fire reduced to embers. The bear lay as always, watching them with unblinking eyes. "Do not go into the forest at night," he said softly. Before either girl could speak, the storm broke in the night, not the gentle rattling of wind through eaves, nor the polite drumming of rain on the roof. This was the kind of storm that split the sky open and hurled its rage upon the earth. Thunder bellowed like a beast in agony, and lightning slashed the heavens into fragments. The cottage shook as though the roots of the forest itself had turned in anger. Snow White and Rose Red lay awake in their beds, too restless to sleep, too shaken to ignore the wrath outside. Their mother, murmuring prayers in the adjoining room, whispered that storms like this always meant something had been disturbed, something bound, now straining at its chains. The bear had left the previous day, lumbering back into the forest with an anxious look over his shoulder, as though he knew what was to come. His absence left the sisters with an odd sense of hollowness. Snow White admitted softly that she missed him, though she could not say why. Rose Red only scowled, though even she sat up long into the night, staring at the door as though expecting him to burst through at any moment. But it was not the bear who came. When dawn broke, wan and grey, the storm's aftermath lay scattered across the land. Trees lay torn in half, branches were speared into the earth like jagged weapons. The roses, both white and red, sagged beneath heavy droplets, their petals torn and bloodied from the wind. Mist clung low across the forest floor, muffling sound, making every shape appear uncertain and shifting. "Something's changed," Snow White whispered as they stood in the doorway. Her pale fingers clutched the wood of the frame until her knuckles blanched. Rose Red tilted her chin defiantly. "Then we will meet it head-on." Together they gathered their baskets and went to fetch firewood. The path that morning seemed different, too narrow, too suffocating, as if the trees had drawn in closer overnight. The sisters pushed through brambles and thorn vines that had not been there before. They cut their arms, scratched their ankles, but pressed on until the sound of a shrill, grating voice froze them mid-step. "Curse it! Miserable, wretched vines! Must you tangle me so?" The sisters peered around the bend of the path and beheld a strange figure caught fast in a thicket of thorns. At first glance, he looked like a child, no taller than Rose Red's waist, but his beard, long and wiry, gave away his age, for it dragged in the dirt nearly to his boots. His clothing was rich but torn, bright silks and embroidered cloth muddied by brambles. He struggled furiously, yanking at the thorns that gripped his beard and sleeves. Rose Red burst out laughing before she could stop herself. "He looks like a beetle caught in a spider's web." The figure's head snapped toward her, and his eyes, small and black like burning coals, narrowed with venom. "Insolent brat, instead of mocking, why don't you make yourselves useful and free me?" Snow White hurried forward with gentleness, tugging carefully at the thorns that wrapped the creature's beard. Rose Red, though still amused, pulled out her small shears and began cutting at the vines. "You'd be torn to pieces if not for us," Snow White said kindly. The little man screeched as though she had insulted him. "Do you think me so weak? Do you think me so helpless that I must rely on simpering girls? Bah! Clumsy creatures, do not pull so hard." Rose Red huffed and gave one last sharp snip with her shears, freeing his beard from the thorn's grasp. The man stumbled free, brushing himself off with great indignation. "Ungrateful wretch," Rose Red muttered. The figure's head whipped toward her, his face red as fire. "Ungrateful? It is you who are ungrateful. Do you know who I am? Do you know the weight of my name? No, you are nothing but forest vermin in patched skirts." Snow White shrank back, troubled by his malice, but Rose Red stepped forward boldly, her eyes flashing. "If that is how you thank those who save you, then perhaps next time we will leave you for the crows, the dwarf." For now it was clear he was no man, but some twisted breed of earth dweller, snarled at them both. His mouth stretched too wide when he grinned, showing yellow, pointed teeth. "You think yourselves brave," he hissed, "but you are children lost in a forest that does not love you. This place grows hungrier by the hour, and when it swallows you, your pretty bones will rattle beneath its roots. Do not meddle where you are not wanted." He turned sharply, his robes swirling like shadows, and vanished into the mist with a scuttling gait. The sisters stood silent for a long moment, the echo of his words gnawing at them. "Did you see his eyes?" Snow White whispered. "Like burning stones, like something that lives too long beneath the earth." Rose Red shuddered despite herself. "I care not for his threats. He was nothing but a nasty old worm with legs." But deep within she felt the sting of his words. The forest did feel hungrier, branches creaking as though bending closer, mist curling into mouths and hands, and always the roses seemed to bloom brighter the darker the woods became, as if feeding on what the storm had left behind. That night, Snow White dreamed of the dwarf's face looming over her bed, his beard coiling around her wrists like ropes. He whispered of treasures buried beneath roots, treasures soaked in blood. She awoke gasping, her skin damp with sweat, and found Rose Red already awake, staring at the window where the roses brushed against the glass. Neither spoke. Days later, they encountered the dwarf again. This time, he was by the river, dragging at a sack that bulged as though filled with stones. The current tugged at it, threatening to sweep it away. The sisters, though wary, rushed to help, for he looked on the verge of being pulled into the waters himself. Rose Red seized the sack and hauled it to shore with surprising strength, while Snow White clung to the dwarf's wiry arms to steady him. Once freed, he rounded on them again with fury. "Idiots! Meddlers! Do you think you did me a kindness? This sack holds treasures beyond your comprehension, and the river nearly claimed them. Had you pulled differently, had you tugged one moment later, I would have lost everything. You are more hindrance than help." Snow White's eyes brimmed with tears at his cruelty, while Rose Red's hands balled into fists. "You should drown with your precious stones, if that is how you speak," she spat. The dwarf hissed like a snake, baring his teeth. "Careful, girl. Tongues as sharp as yours are often cut out in the end." Again, he vanished into the mist, leaving behind the echo of his threat. But the sisters noticed something else this time. When the sack had spilled open briefly, the treasures within were not gold or jewels, but bones, small, delicate bones, children's bones. Snow White covered her mouth to keep from screaming. Rose Red went cold with rage. "What manner of creature is he?" Snow White whispered. "Nothing holy," Rose Red said grimly. That night, they dared not speak of it before their mother, but they could not sleep for the sound of scratching beneath the floorboards, as though something small and sharp was trying to dig its way inside. The bear returned soon after, limping, his fur matted with rain and brambles. He looked thinner, his eyes weary, but when the sisters fell upon him with relief, he rumbled with something like joy, yet he smelled of earth and blood. And when Snow White asked softly what hunted him, he only lowered his great head and whispered, "The dwarf, he seeks what is not his, and he will stop at nothing." The sisters understood then that their lives had become entwined with something far more dangerous than they could yet imagine. The winter deepened. What had seemed in November to be a brief spell of early cold turned into something far more enduring. By December, the forest was weighted under its burden of snow, and the nights had lengthened into oppressive stretches where even the moon seemed weary of offering light. Inside the cottage, firewood burned faster than the mother could split it, and the smoke clung low to the ceiling beams, a choking haze that made Rose Red restless and Snow White's chest tight. Still, the sisters kept to their work. They stitched and mended. They set traps for rabbits when the larder grew bare, and they took turns tending to the fire. Each night, as the hours stretched into silence, their thoughts returned to the bear who came knocking. He had become something between a guest and a shadow in their lives. His visits grew longer, his presence more familiar. He would sprawl on the cottage floor, his fur thawing into damp pools upon the planks. His dark eyes followed them as they worked. Sometimes he spoke, his voice like the grinding of millstones, asking strange questions. Do you dream when the wind howls? And if you do, what hunts you there? Do you find the woods more empty or more crowded when snow covers the tracks? Rose Red laughed off his riddles, treating him like a peculiar uncle who liked to play at frightening, but Snow White rarely laughed. She sensed a hunger in his inquiries, as though he fed not on their answers, but on the act of drawing them forth. It was one such night when the wind screamed through the shutters and the sisters sat close to the fire that the bear stirred from his usual stillness, his great head turned toward the door, ears twitching as though something outside had drawn him taut with awareness. Rose Red noticed first. "What is it?" she asked, setting down her needle. The bear rose onto his hind legs. His bulk filled the room, and the rafters groaned as though disliking his nearness. Snow White stood as well, the hair along her arms prickling. "There is another," the bear said, his voice deeper than she had yet heard it. "Something that should not be walking this night." The mother, who had been drowsing by the hearth, stirred awake at those words. She crossed herself without realizing it. The knock came only moments later, a sound not heavy like the bear's paw, nor timid like a lost traveller's hand. It was a dragging sound, as if something long and sharp scraped against the wood. 3 times it rasped, and then silence fell. Rose Red laughed nervously. A tree branch blown loose, nothing more. But Snow White shook her head. Branches do not knock, and no storm moves them in rhythm. The bear went to the door. He did not open it, but he pressed his muzzle against the wood and inhaled. A growl rose in his throat, a noise that sent Rose Red scrambling closer to her sister. "What is it?" the mother whispered, her hands twisting her apron. The bear turned, and his eyes seemed brighter than firelight, gleaming with something sharp and unkind. An intruder, not man, not beast, a shape made of spite and hunger. It lingers in the snow. The sisters clutched each other. The cottage, though snug, felt suddenly too frail, too thin a shell to hold against such words. The scratching resumed, moving across the wall like claws on bark. It circled the cottage once, dragging, before pausing again at the door. Rose Red, ever the bolder, managed to call out, "Who's there?" Silence, then a voice, low and rasping, as though dragged from the bottom of a frozen river. "Daughters of the rose, daughters of the thorn, open, that I may share your fire." The bear roared before any of them could answer. His bellow rattled pots from their hooks and made the very shutters tremble. "You will not enter here," The thing outside gave a long, scraping sigh, then the sound of retreating footsteps in the snow, though they seemed too many, as though a dozen limbs scuttled away instead of two. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. The mother's face had gone pale, her lips moving soundlessly in prayer. Rose Red forced a laugh, but it came out thin. Snow White said nothing, only kept her hand fastened to her sister's, eyes fixed on the door. The bear lowered himself again, his fur bristling. "Do not stray from this cottage at night," he commanded. "The woods are not empty. They have never been empty. But now something wakes." The mother could not resist asking, "What was it?" The bear looked at her, and for the first time there was pity in his gaze. "A shadow I have long kept at bay. But shadows do not fade in winter, they sharpen." The days that followed grew stranger. Tracks appeared in the snow outside their home, deep gouges, not the marks of deer or wolf. Sometimes the sisters found claw prints that began in the middle of the path, as though the creature had dropped from the sky. Sometimes the prints ended abruptly. No sign of turning, no sign of retreat. Rose Red insisted on going with the bear when he left to prowl the woods at dusk. Snow White argued against it, but her sister laughed her away. "Better to face a shadow than tremble behind a shutter," she said. And so, wrapped in her cloak, she followed the beast into the freezing woods. What she saw there hardened even her brave heart. Shapes between trees, too tall and too thin, shivering without sound. Hollow faces glimpsed between branches, and whispers that came from beneath the snow rather than above it. She returned pale and silent, and after that she no longer spoke so lightly of the forest. Snow White began to dream, dreams of roses black with frost, their petals curling like burned paper, of her mother weeping red tears into her apron, of her sister dancing with a shadow that wore a man's grin stretched too wide. One night she woke to find Rose Red standing over her, a candle in hand, eyes unfocused. Her lips moved, murmuring words. Snow White did not understand. When she touched her sister's arm, Rose Red gasped and dropped the candle, as though waking from a spell. "I don't remember," she whispered when Snow White asked, "only that I felt pulled outside, as though something waited for me." The bear listened to this the next evening, his face grave. "The shadow has chosen her," he said. "Chosen?" the mother asked, clutching her shawl. "As a bride," the bear rumbled, "or a vessel. They are much the same to such things." Rose Red's eyes widened, but she set her jaw. "I will not be anyone's bride, least of all some shadow's." Snow White could not shake her dread, for every night thereafter the scratching came, the rasping voice returned, sweeter now, coaxing, promising. Always it called to Rose Red, always it lingered until the bear drove it back with his roaring. But each time it stayed longer, and each time Rose Red's eyes seemed just a little less her own. The storm had passed, but the forest remained in uneasy stillness. Snow clung to every branch, every root, turning the woods into a monochrome maze of white and black. The roses had survived stubbornly, as though resisting the cold and the snow, but their petals had darkened at the edges, black veins snaking through crimson and ivory alike. Snow White noticed it first, kneeling in the snow to inspect one bloom that seemed almost to pulse beneath her fingers. "Something is wrong with them," she whispered to Rose Red, who had been kicking snow from the path as they went to check the traps. Rose Red glanced down at the roses, frowning. "They're just cold. Stop being so fanciful." Snow White's hands hovered over the petals, her chest tight with foreboding. There was something alive beneath the colour, a slow, deliberate quiver that made her recoil. She had no doubt that if she cut the bloom, it might shriek, or worse, bite. "You will see," she said softly, more to herself than to her sister. Inside the cottage, the bear sat by the fire, silent as stone. He had returned from the forest earlier that day, his fur slick with melting snow, and his eyes weary from tracking what moved in the dark. Snow White watched him carefully, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way he flexed his massive claws as though preparing for battle. "Something comes," he said at last, his voice low, like distant thunder. "And it is hungry," Rose Red scoffed. "The forest is always hungry. We've survived worse than snow and wolves." "Not like this," Snow White whispered. That evening, the first sign appeared. It started with a sound, soft at first, a whispering among the roses in the garden. Snow White heard it while carrying water from the well. She stopped, cocking her head. "Did you hear that?" she asked Rose Red, who was stacking firewood nearby. "Hear what?" her sister replied, tossing a log onto the pile. Snow White pointed. "The roses, they speak." Rose Red laughed. "You're imagining it. Go back inside." But the whispering continued, rising into a murmur that she could almost understand. It was like voices pressed through ice, low, coaxing and insistent. The bear appeared at the doorway, without sound, looming as always. He did not speak at first, simply watching Snow White, with eyes that glimmered in the firelight. "They call to her," he said finally. "Do not answer." Snow White drew a breath, her fingers still trembling over the petals. "Call to her? Who?" "The shadow," he replied. "The shadow?" Rose Red's voice was sharp. "Yes," the bear said. "It walks between the trees. It has teeth for promises and claws for laughter. And it knows your sister." Rose Red's hands tightened into fists. "It will find nothing but anger in me." Snow White, however, felt a chill run down her spine. Even as she watched the bear, she could see the shadows stretching unnaturally in the corners of the cottage, curling like smoke toward the roses. They whispered in the language of hunger, and she realized with a shiver that the roses themselves had begun to move, slowly, deliberately, as if guided by an unseen hand. Night came, thick and black, and with it the first direct assault. The scratching started at the window, a deliberate rhythm that made Rose Red stir in her sleep. Snow White rose quietly, slipping out of bed to peek through the shutters. What she saw made her gasp. The roses in the garden were moving, writhing like serpents, their stems stretching impossibly long. Black thorns scraped against the window pane. In their midst, the shadow moved, a thin, impossible figure with gleaming eyes, hovering above the snow without leaving footprints. Snow White slammed the shutters shut and turned to the bear, who had followed her silently. "It is here," she whispered. "Yes," he rumbled, "and it seeks her." Rose Red awoke, grabbing her sister's arm. "Seek me? What are you saying?" "It is drawn to you," Snow White said, her voice tight with fear. The bear lowered his head, his breath steaming. "It has been watching since before the dwarf freed it. It hungers for the warmth you carry, and it will not leave until it has claimed a piece of you." Rose Red's blood ran cold, though she tried to mask it with bravado. "Then it shall find none," she said, drawing a small knife from her bedside. But the bear shook his massive head. "Blades will not cut it. Fire may hurt, but it will return. You are dealing with something older than the snow, older than the forest. You must survive it, not strike at it blindly." The nights grew longer and darker. Each time they woke, the roses had moved closer to the cottage. Their blackened thorns scratched at the walls, sometimes even through the shutters. Snow White and Rose Red began to sleep in shifts, keeping watch while the bear prowled near the garden. One night, Snow White dared to step outside. The bear growled low in warning, but she ignored it, drawn to a single rose that glowed faintly in the moonlight. She knelt beside it, reaching for the petals, and the whispering rose shivered. "Do not touch me," a voice hissed from the darkness. Snow White froze. The shadow had emerged fully now, a slender, impossible silhouette, its eyes like molten gold. It glided across the snow, coming closer with every step. The bear lunged forward, but the shadow darted aside with unnatural speed, wrapping around the roses. The petals shivered violently, releasing a scent that made Snow White's head spin, a sweet, intoxicating aroma that called to her very soul. "Come," it whispered, "come with me, stay with us, and you shall never hunger, never fear, never feel pain again." Snow White recoiled, but the pull was magnetic, something deep within her mind, tugging toward the voice. The roses around her bent in toward her, thorns brushing her arms, petals grazing her skin. The bear roared, slamming himself into the thicket, claws raking the snow, but even he could not reach her in time. Rose Red appeared then, plunging into the garden. Her eyes burned with a feral light, and she swung her knife at the nearest rose, cutting through stem after stem. The petals screamed, blackened liquid spilling onto the snow. The shadow recoiled but did not vanish. Its eyes found rose red, narrowing with a patience that unnerved even her. It had chosen both sisters now, and it would not be denied. The bear pressed closer, his massive bulk shielding Snow White. His voice shook with rage and warning. "You cannot fight this alone. You must trust me." Snow White stepped back, her fingers trembling. "I trust you," she whispered. Rose Red, still holding her knife, nodded grimly. "Then we fight together." The shadow hissed, retreating for the moment, but the roses continued to twitch and pulse. Snow White knew in her heart that this was only the beginning. The shadow would not give up. It had tasted fear, and it had smelled desire. It would return, and next time it would bring the dwarf with it. And when it came, it would take more than just their innocence. Winter deepened its grip on the forest. Nights stretched long and unyielding, with the moon swallowed by thick clouds, and the stars hidden behind the sky's frozen curtain. The sisters' cottage, once a sanctuary, had begun to feel like a fragile cage. Every snap of a branch, every whisper of wind against the shutters, carried with it a pulse of menace that made their hearts thud in unison. The bear remained their constant sentinel. Each evening he prowled the perimeter of the cottage, sniffing the snow and listening for intruders. Yet even his vigilance was not enough to quell the unease that had settled like frost in their bones. Snow White had begun to dream more vividly, the shadow infiltrating her sleep with visions of roses blackened and twisted, thorns coiling around her sister's arms and pulling her toward some unseen moor. Rose Red, once fearless, now woke trembling, her knife clutched in her hand, even when no one threatened her. It was during one of these long nights that the dwarf appeared again. This time, there was no warning scratching at the door, no soft rustle through the roses. He emerged from the snow as though conjured by it, his wiry frame hunched, his eyes glinting like coals caught in frost, his beard, tangled and matted with ice, swept across the ground like a living thing. "You keep what is not yours," he hissed. "Do you not understand the weight of what you shelter? The bear is mine, bound by chains older than your forest, and you have fed him, raised him in defiance of my claim. That cannot stand." Rose Red gritted her teeth. "We owe you nothing. That bear has harmed no one." "Harmed no one," the dwarf spat, snowflakes scattering like broken teeth. "It has harmed the balance, and you, foolish girls, have encouraged it. The shadow now follows, and it hungers. You will not survive the night if you do not return him to me." The bear growled low in warning. Do not listen, he rumbled, eyes flicking toward the forest line. He is the voice of chains, not justice. He seeks dominion, not balance. Snow White stepped between them, feeling the weight of the storm pressing against her. If the shadow is coming because of him, then what are we to do? If we return the bear, the forest will change. The dwarf's grin stretched unnaturally wide. Ah, the clever one speaks at last. You are wise enough to see the consequences, yet not wise enough to stop them. The bear's freedom is your choice, but freedom comes at a cost. The shadow waits, and it will not be denied. Before they could respond, a shriek echoed through the trees, a sound like glass shattering in the wind, high and piercing, yet carried weight that rattled the very shutters. The roses outside quivered violently, their blackened petals shaking as though caught in a convulsion. The dwarf laughed, a sound like ice cracking. You see, the shadow tests you already. Every moment you delay, it grows stronger, it hungers, and it learns. Rose Red, trembling but defiant, raised her knife. Then we fight. The dwarf shook his head slowly, almost sadly. You cannot fight that which is neither flesh nor bone. You can only endure it, and even then, not without sacrifice. At that moment, the bear shifted, his body tensed like a drawn bow, fur bristling with frost and snow. I will defend them, he said, voice low and vibrating through the floorboards. But you must understand, it will not be enough. The shadow has waited centuries for this chance, and it will take more than claws and fire to stop it. Snow White glanced at her sister, who had gone pale but stood her ground. Then we do what we must, she whispered. The night came alive with movement. Shadows moved under the snow, coiling like snakes. The roses twisted unnaturally, petals curling into shapes that suggested mouths and eyes. Snow White and Rose Red stood side by side. The bear crouched before them, a wall of living fur and muscle. The shadow emerged first, slithering across the snow like smoke given form. Its eyes glimmered like molten gold, watching, calculating, hungry. Around it, the roses writhed and hissed, black thorns snapping as if testing the air for weakness. Snow White felt a tug at her soul, a pull toward the dark figure. Her knees shook, but she pressed against it, forcing herself to resist. The bear growled, stepping forward and smashing one of the nearest roses with a swipe of his paw. The blackened petals screamed in a soundless agony and collapsed into the snow. Rose Red lunged at another, stabbing her knife through the thorny stem. The shadow recoiled slightly, hissing, but did not flee. It circled them slowly, almost lazily, as if studying the sisters and the bear, gauging their weaknesses. Then the dwarf appeared from behind the trees, his small figure impossibly fast, moving closer to the cottage line. You see, he called, voice high and sharp, you cannot hold it. It is mine. It hungers for blood, and your feeble protection will not last." The bear roared, charging at the dwarf, but the man was nimble. He leaped aside, disappearing into the blackened trees, only to reappear moments later, hurling shards of ice from his hands. Each shard tore through the air with a shriek, splitting snow-laden branches and slicing near the sisters' feet. Snow White stumbled back, heart hammering. "We cannot fight him and the shadow," Rose Red, face set like stone, shouted. "Then we fight anyway!" Together, the sisters lunged at the nearest roses, cutting through stem after stem, shrieking at the unnatural twisting, feeling the ice chill burn against their palms. The shadow shrank back from the moving, slashing forms, but it did not vanish. It lingered, eyes fixed, calculating the moment they might falter. The bear charged again, raking claws through the blackened petals, scattering them like bloodied snow. He caught sight of the dwarf, who had raised his hands to cast another spell. With a leap that seemed impossible for a creature his size, the bear closed the distance and pinned the dwarf to the ground. The man screamed, shrieking curses that froze the very air, but the bear held him fast. "Do not," the dwarf hissed, his teeth bared. "Do not think this is over. The shadow will take her. It will take you both." Snow White stepped closer, her eyes meeting the bear's. "Then we endure it together." With a sudden roar, the bear released the dwarf and charged toward the shadow. It shrank back, writhing among the roses, but Snow White felt a sharp tug at her heart, almost pulling her to the dark figure. She resisted, taking Rose Red's hand, holding her tightly, as though their unity alone could ward off the unseen evil. The dwarf, regaining his balance, vanished into the trees once more, screaming promises of vengeance and claiming. The shadow receded for now, leaving behind a field of blackened roses and twisted snow, but the sisters knew it would return. It would not forget. It would only grow stronger. The bear lowered himself to the ground, panting, eyes weary. "This was only a test," he said, voice low and rough. "The shadow will come again, and next time it will bring hunger closer to your hearts." Snow White pressed her hand against his massive head. "We will endure it," she whispered. Rose Red, breathing heavily, looked at the blackened garden. But at what cost? The answer lay in the twisted roses, the dark snow, and the whisper of the wind through the forest. The shadow waited, patient and eternal, and the dwarf's claim was far from finished. The wind carried a sharper chill that night, cutting through the cottage walls and rattling the shutters as though it sought entrance. Snow White and Rose Red huddled near the fire, their hands clasped tightly, though even the warmth could not chase away the gnawing unease. Outside, the forest lay blanketed in snow, but even in its frozen silence, a sinister rhythm pulsed, soft, deliberate, impossible to ignore. The bear had grown restless, pacing the floor, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. His eyes, dark and fathomless, darted toward every shadow, following each creak of the old timber as though it might conceal a predator. "It will come tonight," he said, voice low and gravelly. "It tests your strength. It wants to see if you will hold or if you will crumble." Rose Red gripped her knife, teeth clenched. "Then we will not crumble. Let it try." Snow White, however, felt her resolve falter. The dreams had grown more vivid, more demanding. The shadow was not content to remain outside. It tugged at the edges of her mind, even while awake, whispering promises and threats, with a voice that slithered under her skin. The first sign came just before midnight, a scratching, softer than before, almost polite in its persistence. Snow White froze, listening. It circled the cottage, and though it was silent, every window pane reflected the faintest shimmer of movement, thin, elongated shapes that shifted across the snow. Rose Red tightened her grip on the knife. "It comes," she said quietly. The bear's ears twitched. "Do not approach the door," he warned. "Do not give it invitation." The scratching stopped. For a moment, only the sound of the wind through the chimney filled the room. Then the voice came, low, coaxing, impossible to place. "Daughters of the rose, daughters of the thorn," it whispered, "open, that I may warm your hearts." Snow White felt her knees weaken. The words curled around her mind, promising safety, comfort, and release from the fear that had begun to tighten around her chest. She wanted to run to the door, to open it, to give herself to the promise. But Rose Red pressed a hand to her shoulder. "Do not listen," she said firmly. "It lies. It only hungers." The shadow advanced. No footsteps marked its approach. It moved as though the snow itself had given it form. The roses outside writhed violently, petals blackened and sharp, scraping against the window pane. A hiss rose from them like steam, escaping under pressure. The bear sprang to the door, slamming his paw against it. "Back!" he roared. "I will not allow it near you." The door rattled violently as the shadow pressed against it, unseen fingers scratching and testing the wood. The sisters huddled together, feeling the cold of the dark pressing into their bones. Snow White's hair rose on end as a whisper threaded through her mind. "Let me in, and you shall never fear again." Rose Red struck at the nearest rose with her knife, slicing through stem and thorn, petals screaming instantly into the snow. The shadow recoiled slightly, but did not vanish. Its golden eyes found her, and for a heartbeat, she felt as though it could see into her very soul. Hours passed in a blur of tension. Every whisper of the wind became a threat. Every crack of the fire a signal of impending danger. The bear remained vigilant, crouched like a mountain of fur beside the sisters. growling low at any movement outside. It was then that the dwarf returned. Unlike before, he did not approach timidly. He appeared in the doorway with a speed that seemed impossible, small and wiry, yet radiating power. His eyes blazed like frozen coals, scanning the room. "You cannot hold it forever," he hissed, voice sharp as ice. "The shadow hungers, and your defiance only strengthens its wrath. Give me the bear, and the shadow may yet be contained. Refuse, and all of you will be claimed." Snow White's heart thundered in her chest. "We will never give him up," she said, voice steady despite fear. The dwarf's grin widened. "Then you shall see how quickly hope turns to ruin." With a flick of his wrist, shards of ice erupted from the floorboards, spreading across the cottage like a frozen wave. The fire hissed, smoke curling thick and choking. Snow White and Rose Red struggled to avoid the ice, the bear shielding them with his massive bulk. Yet the shadow took advantage of the chaos, slipping inside like smoke through a crack in the wall. It glided past the sisters, brushing against their hair, its cold so intense that it burned their skin. The roses somehow had followed. Black petals pressing against their ankles, tangling in their skirts. Snow White tried to pull free, but the thorns cut deep, crimson streaking the white snow on the floor. "Stay together," Rose Red shouted, slashing at the nearest rose. Her knife flashed, silver in the firelight, and she cut through stems with desperate precision. The shadow paused, twisting unnaturally in the firelight, its golden eyes fixed on Snow White, and a voice hissed inside her mind, separate from the dwarf's threats. "You belong to me, your warmth, your hope, your fear, all mine." Snow White's hand shook, but she gripped her sister's arm. "No," she whispered. "We are together. You will not take us." The bear roared, lashing out with claws and teeth, scattering roses and ice alike. The dwarf screamed in fury, hurling another spell that twisted the fire into black smoke. The cottage filled with acrid odour and a sense of weight pressing down, as if the air itself sought to crush them. Rose Red shouted, "We fight, we endure," and endure they did. Snow White, Rose Red, and the bear formed a triangle of resistance, cutting and striking, bracing and shielding. Outside, the shadow circled, golden eyes flashing, hissing with frustration. The dwarf, caught between attacking and cursing, realised that his control was slipping. For a moment, the sisters glimpsed something in the shadow's form, hints of the dwarf's own malevolence intertwined with it. It was not only a creature of hunger, but a reflection of his spite, sharpened by centuries of manipulation and dark magic. The night dragged on, a ceaseless battle of wills, and though the shadow had entered, it did not claim them. Not yet. Exhaustion weighed heavy on their limbs, hearts hammering like war drums. But for the first time, Snow White realised something vital. The shadow was tethered. "Rose Red," she whispered. "It cannot exist without him." The bear growled, eyes narrowing. "Yes, as long as the dwarf draws breath, the shadow remains. Cut the chain, and it will falter." Rose Red nodded grimly. "Then that is what we must do. No mercy, no hesitation." The dwarf, sensing their understanding, screamed in fury, hurling shards of ice and twisting the air with curses. The shadow shrieked in response, black roses thrashing violently, but the sisters, hand in hand, and the bear, crouched and ready, prepared for what might be the final stand. The storm outside had ended, but a far greater one raged within the walls of the little cottage. The night had reached its zenith, a black so deep that even the moon's pale glow seemed swallowed by shadow. The little cottage trembled under the combined weight of winter and magic, the air thick with the scent of fire, ice, and blackened roses. Snow White and Rose Red stood together in the centre of the room, hands clasped. The bear crouched beside them like a living wall of fur and muscle. The dwarf had returned, his small frame barely contained within the doorway. His eyes blazed with fury, his voice a rasping whip. "You cannot win," he hissed. "The shadow is mine, and I am eternal." The shadow itself hovered at the edges of the room, blackened petals and smoke swirling around it. Its golden eyes gleamed hungrily, and the roses outside rattled against the windows and door, thrumming with life. Snow White's chest tightened as she realised how tethered the shadow was to the dwarf. Without him, it could not fully manifest. The bear growled low, a warning and a promise all at once. "It ends tonight," he said, voice like thunder. "Either the chain breaks, or all of you are claimed." Rose Red gritted her teeth, tightening her grip on her knife. "Then we break it." The sisters moved in unison. Snow White drew a circle of salt around the fire, a thin barrier against the dark forces pressing against them. Rose Red cut through the nearest blackened roses, their petals shrieking in silent agony as the shadow recoiled with every strike. The dwarf hissed in fury, hurling shards of ice at them, but the bear blocked them, his massive body absorbing the cold shards like a wall of living stone. "You dare resist me!" the dwarf shrieked, flinging a spell that twisted the fire into black smoke. The room filled with acrid fumes, stinging eyes and lungs. Snow White coughed but forced herself to focus, her mind tethered to Rose Red, tethered to the bear. "You are nothing without it," Snow White whispered fiercely, her eyes locked on the dwarf. "And it is nothing without you." The shadow writhed violently, thrashing against the invisible chain that bound it to the dwarf. Its golden eyes flashed between the sisters and the man, a mix of hunger and fear. The bear lunged forward, massive paws pinning the dwarf to the ground. Snow White and Rose Red, moving together, circled the man, cutting through the roses and thrusting their hands toward him. A chant rose from their lips, not of words, but of intention, of unity, of refusing fear. The bear growled, a low vibration that seemed to resonate through the floorboards, amplifying their power. The dwarf screamed, writhing, twisting, but the circle held. The shadow, tethered and wild, shrieked as it was pulled back toward him, thrashing violently, petals and smoke flying across the room. Snow White reached forward, planting her hands on the dwarf's chest, feeling the pulse of his power. "You cannot hold them," she shouted. "Not now, not ever." The dwarf's eyes blazed, and the shadow screamed, a sound that made the walls tremble and the roses wilt. The bear roared, a deafening, primal sound, and in unison the sisters pressed, their will, their unity, their courage converging to a force too strong for the dwarf to resist. With a final, shrieking cry, the chain between the dwarf and the shadow snapped. The shadow screamed one last time, golden eyes blazing, before dissipating into black smoke that swirled and vanished into the night. The roses collapsed, black petals dissolving into snow, leaving the garden silent and still. The dwarf lay pinned beneath the bear, panting, his small body trembling. For a moment he looked human, and Snow White felt a pang of pity, but she knew that any mercy would be a mistake. The bear leaned close, whispering into her mind, "End him. Do not give him a chance to rise again." Snow White nodded. With a swift motion, Rose Red drove her knife down, severing the last tie between dwarf and magic. The man screamed, a sound that echoed through the forest, before collapsing into snow, motionless. The cottage fell silent. The fire crackled gently. The wind outside was a soft sigh rather than a roar, and the blackened roses had vanished, leaving only fresh snow glittering under the moonlight. Snow White sank to her knees, exhausted, hands trembling, and Rose Red wrapped her in a hug. The bear lowered himself beside them, fur ruffled, but eyes soft. "You have endured," he said quietly. "The shadow is gone, and the dwarf's claim is broken. But understand, magic leaves its mark. The forest remembers. You will always carry this night within you." Snow White looked up at him, her mind clearing. "Then we carry it together," Rose Red nodded, brushing snow from her hair. "Together," she echoed. The storm had passed. The cottage, though battered, stood firm. The roses, once blackened, would bloom again in spring, though perhaps with a faint shadow of winter in their stems. The bear rose, massive and noble, before turning toward the forest. "I must leave now," he said. "The spell that bound me here is broken, but my path is no longer yours. Remember me not as a beast, but as a guardian, and remember always, the forest is alive, and it watches." Snow White stepped forward, placing her hand on his broad head. "We will not forget." Rose Red added, "Thank you for everything," with a final, deep rumble. The bear disappeared into the forest, leaving the sisters in the quiet glow of the hearth, hearts still pounding, but free from the shadow's grip. In the weeks that followed, spring returned to the forest. Snow melted, revealing the first green shoots of grass beneath. The roses bloomed again, crimson and white, delicate and alive. The sisters worked the land, their bond stronger than ever, each aware of the night that had changed them, but also of the courage and unity that had seen them through. The memory of the shadow lingered, yes, and the knowledge of the bear's true nature remained, a secret shared between them. But in its place, hope had taken root, stronger than fear, more enduring than any winter. The forest remained alive with magic, yes, but the sisters knew they were no longer powerless within it. They had faced the shadow, broken the chain, and in doing so had learned the depth of their strength. And as for the roses, they bloomed brighter than ever, each petal a testament to survival, courage, and the enduring power of sisterhood.